The illusion of love. They say that the people who know your deepest vulnerabilities are either your greatest protectors or your most dangerous enemies. For 12 long years, I believed my husband Arthur was my ultimate protector. As a pediatric nurse, my entire life revolved around healing, empathy, and standing by those who were at their weakest. When I met Arthur, he was an ambitious residency student with nothing but a brilliant mind and a cold, calculating determination. I fell in love with that focus. I worked double shifts, skipped meals, and gave up my own dreams of advanced medical research just to pay his tuition, to make sure his hands never shook from the stress of rent or unpaid bills. I still remember the night he finally made partner at one of the most elite medical facilities in New York. He looked into my eyes, held my hands, and said, "Sarah, everything I build for us. You are the foundation of my life." Those words felt like a sacred vow, but looking back now, I realize his eyes weren't looking at me. They were looking right through me, calculating exactly how much more juice he could squeeze out of my devotion before tossing the rind away. Our life looked flawless from the outside. We moved into a sprawling suburban home. Arthur's name was plastered across medical journals, and he became the golden boy of the hospital board. But somewhere along the line, the gratitude faded into an insufferable arrogance. He didn't see a partner anymore. He saw a simple, plain clinic nurse who belonged in scrubs while he belonged in custom-tailored Italian suits. I stayed quiet, believing that the high-stress environment of surgical politics was just taking its toll on him. I told myself that beneath that icy, detached exterior, the man who loved me was still there. I was wrong. The man I loved never existed. He was just an actor waiting for his cue to drop the mask. The first real crack appeared on a cold Tuesday winter evening. Arthur had been coming home later and later, his excuses always wrapped in the noble fabric of emergency procedures, late-night board meetings, and clinical trials. But a wife's intuition doesn't listen to logical excuses. It listens to the silence between the words. It notices the way a phone is placed face down on the kitchen counter. It registers the sudden change in digital passwords under the guise of hospital data security protocols. One night, while he was asleep, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. It wasn't a medical alert. It was a message from an unsaved number that read, "The reservation at the Grand Gala is confirmed. I can't wait to see you in that suit, Arthur. She doesn't belong there, but I do." My heart dropped into a bottomless pit. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, the glowing letters burning into my retinas. I looked at Arthur, sleeping peacefully beside me, the man whose hands I had held through every failure and triumph. Who was she? And why didn't I belong at a gala meant for hospital partners? The next morning, when I asked him about the upcoming medical event, his face didn't flinch. His expression remained as smooth and unreadable as a surgical mask. "Sarah, it's a high-level corporate networking event," he said, casually adjusting his silver watch without even looking at me. "It's full of venture capitalists, hospital executives, and political donors. You'd be bored out of your mind. Besides, someone needs to stay back and manage the household affairs. Don't look too deep into things that don't concern your department." The coldness in his voice was like a physical blow. He wasn't just hiding something. He was actively pushing me into the background of his life, rewriting my role from his co-creator to a mere domestic servant. But the true horror of his transformation wasn't just a hidden text message or a missed party. It was something far more sinister, something that involved the legacy of the only person who had ever loved me unconditionally, my father. A month later, my father passed away. He was a humble man, a retired school teacher who had spent his entire life saving every single penny so that I would never have to worry about my future. He left me a massive inheritance, a dedicated trust fund worth nearly $2 million, explicitly meant to secure my life, my stability, and my peace of mind. When the legal paperwork arrived, Arthur was suddenly the most attentive, comforting husband in the world. He wiped my tears, held me close during the funeral, and whispered how we needed to protect this legacy. "Sarah, you're grieving," he told me, his voice dripping with synthetic warmth. "Let me handle the financial integration. We should consolidate your father's trust into our primary high-yield accounts under my corporate network. It will maximize the interest, protect it from heavy taxation, and keep it safe for our future. You trust me, don't you?" I was completely broken by grief. I didn't care about numbers, accounts, or bank codes. I just wanted my father back. So, blindly, foolishly, I signed the authorization forms. I gave Arthur full management access over my inheritance, believing that a husband and wife were a single unit, a locked vault that no one could breach. But life has a cruel way of delivering reality checks. Just 3 weeks after the funds were transferred into his controlled network, I collapsed during a grueling 12-hour shift at the pediatric ward. The world went dark, and when I opened my eyes, I wasn't the nurse anymore. I was the patient lying under the cold fluorescent lights of an examination room. The diagnostic tests were merciless. A malignant, aggressive tumor was growing near my spine. It required immediate, highly specialized neurosurgery, followed by intensive rehabilitation. The cost was astronomical, but as I sat there holding the medical papers, I didn't panic. I thought of my father's trust. I thought of the $2 million sitting safely in our accounts. I looked at the doctor and said, "Schedule the surgery for next week. My husband will clear the funds immediately." When I told Arthur about the diagnosis, I expected fear, panic, or at least a shred of human empathy. Instead, his face turned completely rigid, his eyes shifting across the room as if calculating the profit and loss margins of my survival. "Surgery next week?" he muttered, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Sarah, that particular neurosurgeon is outside our standard insurance network. The out-of-pocket deposit alone is over $300,000. Pulling that kind of liquidity out of my integrated corporate accounts right now will disrupt my entire investment portfolio for the upcoming hospital board election." I stared at him, completely paralyzed by disbelief. "Your portfolio? Arthur, this is my father's inheritance. That money was literally left behind to save my life. It's my money." He stood up, towering over my hospital bed, his demeanor shifting into that of a cold, ruthless corporate executive. "The money is currently tied up in a high-security institutional network under my corporate entity, Sarah. Legally and logistically, it cannot be touched without causing a massive red flag on my financial statements. The board is auditing all partners this month for the upcoming chief of surgery position. I cannot have an irregular, massive withdrawal ruin my chances. We will look into alternative, cheaper clinical trials later this year. Just rest for now." With those words, he grabbed his briefcase and walked out of the room, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the hospital ward. He hadn't just locked my inheritance. He had actively decided that his corporate ambitions, his precious board seat, and his pristine financial records were worth more than my actual breathing, living body. That night, lying alone in the dark, the tears didn't come. Something else took their place. A cold, crystalline clarity washed over me. I realized that if I remained the victim, I would die in this bed while he climbed to the top of his medical empire using my father's blood money. I reached into my bag, pulled out my nurse's tablet, and stared at the login screen of the hospital's inner network. Arthur thought I was just a simple clinic nurse who didn't understand high society or digital systems. He forgot one crucial detail. I was the one who set up his very first digital profile when he couldn't even format a basic medical report. I knew his patterns, I knew his ego, and I was about to find out exactly what he was hiding behind that locked network. The human body is an intricate network of pathways, and as a nurse, my job was to understand exactly where the blockages were. The digital world is no different. Arthur's entire professional life, his hidden offshore accounts, his corporate investments, and his personal communications were all managed through a highly secure, encrypted private server network that he had established through the hospital's premium infrastructure. He considered it a fortress, but every fortress has a back door, usually left open by the builder's own arrogance. Using my administrative medical credentials and my deep knowledge of Arthur's personal details, his old student ID numbers, his first research publication dates, and the specific sequence of numbers he used for everything, I began tracing his digital footprint. I didn't sleep that night. While the IV drip quietly ticked away beside my bed, my fingers moved across the screen with a precision that surprised even me. Around 3:00 a.m., the first breakthrough happened. I bypassed the secondary firewall of his personal LLC account. When the directory loaded, my breath hitched in my throat. There wasn't just a financial portfolio in there. There was a dedicated, hidden subfolder labeled under a generic medical abbreviation, GL Project. When I opened it, the true depth of his depravity was laid bare. My father's $2 million trust fund hadn't been put into a safe conservative investment index. It had been diverted entirely into a private offshore dummy corporation based in the Cayman Islands. And from that account, massive payments were being made to a luxury real estate developer in Manhattan for a penthouse suite, and to a high-end luxury dealership for a custom sports car registered under a name I had never seen before: Victoria Vance. Victoria Vance wasn't just a random name. A quick search through the hospital's internal executive directory revealed exactly who she was. She was the young, charismatic daughter of the hospital's majority shareholder, the very man who controlled the voting bloc for the upcoming chief of surgery election. Arthur wasn't just having a simple, reckless affair. He was treating his entire personal life as a strategic corporate merger. He was using my father's lifetime of hard-earned savings to buy luxury gifts, dynamic penthouse apartments, and high-end lifestyle tokens for a woman who could hand him the keys to the entire medical empire. As I scrolled through their archived personal emails, which he had foolishly synchronized with his secure corporate network for convenience, I found messages that broke whatever remaining piece of my heart was left. "Don't worry about Sarah," Arthur had written to Victoria just 2 weeks prior. "She's just a simple clinic nurse. Her world starts and ends with basic hospital shifts. She doesn't have the vision, the elegance, or the status to stand by my side when I take over the board. Once the election is finalized and the inheritance funds are completely integrated into our new joint offshore structure, I'll handle the separation. For now, she's useful to keep the domestic background quiet." Reading those words felt like being dissected alive without anesthesia. The man I had spent a decade building up looked at me as an embarrassing footnote, an administrative utility to be discarded when his shiny new life was ready. He was actively waiting for me to succumb to my illness, or at least be too weak to fight back, while he and Victoria built their throne on my father's grave. But as the initial shock faded, a cold, unshakable rage took over. They wanted a clinical execution? I was going to give them a lesson in complete anatomical destruction. But as I dug deeper into the financial records of Arthur's private corporate network, I noticed something irregular. Arthur was brilliant with a scalpel, but when it came to complex international financial compliance, his arrogance had led him to make a catastrophic error. To move my father's massive trust fund across international borders without triggering immediate federal tax flags, he had utilizing a highly gray market digital transaction protocol. He had tied his personal medical corporation's master encryption key directly to the offshore account transfers. In simple terms, he had created a single, unified digital bridge. If that bridge stood, he was completely untouchable. But if someone managed to access the core root directory of his corporate network, they wouldn't just see his personal files, they would have full administrative control over the entire financial, legal, and professional network he had built. He had consolidated everything into one place to make himself look like a financial genius to his new mistress, unaware that he had essentially built his entire empire on a digital landmine. I leaned back against my pillows, staring at the flashing green cursor on my screen. My tumor was aggressive, yes, but my mind was completely untouched. I realized that traditional legal methods would take years. If I hired a standard divorce lawyer, Arthur would use his massive wealth, his high-powered hospital attorneys, and his connections with the majority shareholder to tie me up in court until my medical condition took care of the problem for him. He had locked my funds, leaving me to die. If I wanted to survive, if I wanted justice, I couldn't just sue him. I had to completely dismantle his entire existence from the inside out, using the very network he used to trap me. To pull off an operation of this scale, I couldn't do it entirely alone from a hospital bed. I needed professional surgical precision outside the hospital walls. The next morning, I used my personal phone to call someone I hadn't spoken to in years. My older brother, David. David was a senior systems architect and a cyber compliance expert for a major federal banking institution in Washington. When our father passed away, David had been suspicious of Arthur's sudden eagerness to manage the trust, but I had defended my husband out of blind loyalty. When David walked into my hospital room and saw me hooked up to monitors, holding the diagnostic reports of my spinal tumor, his face turned completely pale. But when I turned my tablet around and showed him the cloned data directories, the offshore transfers, the luxury real estate contracts for Victoria Vance, and the email where Arthur explicitly detailed leaving me to die for his board seat, David's eyes turned into cold blocks of ice. "He didn't just break the law, Sarah," David whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying, quiet fury. "He used an institutional banking exploit to bypass federal trust regulations. If we report this normally, the funds will be frozen in litigation for 5 years, and he'll buy his way out with high-end defense firms." "I don't want to report him normally, David," I said, looking straight into his eyes with a calm that startled him. "He told his mistress that I'm just a simple nurse who doesn't understand high society or complex networks. I want to show him exactly what happens when a simple nurse executes a total clear protocol on his entire life. I need you to help me build a digital legal cage that he cannot escape from." David looked at the screen, then looked back at me, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "Tell me exactly what you need." For the next 2 weeks, my hospital room became the command center of a silent, invisible war. Arthur rarely visited. When he did, he would stand near the door for 5 minutes, look at his watch, make a few generic remarks about hospital administrative pressures, and leave. He thought I was getting weaker. He thought the heavy medication was dulling my senses. In reality, I was coordinating with David every single hour, mapping out every node, every account, and every professional credential tied to Arthur's name. We called our strategy the Total Clear Protocol. It wasn't just a divorce filing. It was a synchronized digital and legal strike designed to deploy simultaneously across 3 specific fronts: his personal finances, his professional standing with the medical board, and his social status in high society. David managed to establish a secure mirror port inside Arthur's private network. Because Arthur had integrated my father's trust money using my own legal signature through a joint marital entity, I legally still possessed 50% administrative control over the master corporate shell. Arthur had hidden the interface behind a complex multi-factor authentication wall, assuming I would never have the technical literacy to find it. But David built an automated script that utilized my legitimate biometric data and security answers to quietly claim secondary root-level access. We didn't move a single dollar yet. We didn't change a single password. We just sat there in the shadows, watching him transfer more funds, watching him prepare for his grand night, waiting for the exact moment of maximum vulnerability. While tracking his daily transactions, we discovered something even more explosive. Arthur's ambition hadn't just led him to commit marital financial fraud, it had led him into outright criminal medical malpractice. To secure his board seat, he had been collaborating with a high-end private medical device manufacturer. He had been quietly substituting standard, hospital-approved pediatric surgical equipment with unapproved, highly profitable prototype components from this specific manufacturer in exchange for massive, undisclosed stock options hidden in his Cayman accounts. As a pediatric nurse, this was the absolute limit. Seeing him neglect me was one thing, but seeing him endanger innocent children for corporate kickbacks turned my cold anger into a burning, unyielding crusade for justice. I meticulously copied every single batch code, every unapproved purchase order, and every internal email chain where he ordered his junior residents to use these unauthorized devices without documenting them in the primary hospital records. "This isn't just a financial dispute anymore, Sarah," David said during a secure, encrypted video call. "This is a full-scale federal investigation waiting to happen. If we launch this data correctly, he won't just lose his wealth, he will lose his freedom." "We launch it on his night," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "The annual Grand Medical Gala is in 10 days. That's the night the board votes on the new chief of surgery. That's the night he plans to announce his partnership with Victoria Vance and officially discard me. We will let him climb to the very top of his mountain, David, because the fall from the peak is the only one you can't get up from." To ensure I survived long enough to see justice served, I used my secondary root access to quietly extract the $300,000 surgical deposit directly from Arthur's hidden Cayman account, routing it back into the hospital's primary billing system as an anonymous institutional research grant dedicated to my specific neurosurgery. I didn't want Arthur to see a massive withdrawal alert from his personal bank app, so David masked the transaction as an internal system credit rebalancing within the hospital's master ledger. The surgery was performed in absolute secrecy by a world-class neurosurgeon who had no ties to Arthur's corrupt circle. Arthur was so busy preparing for his gala, spending nights at Victoria's penthouse, and practicing his acceptance speech, that he didn't even realize his own wife was undergoing a life-saving spinal procedure under his own roof. When I woke up in the recovery pavilion 48 hours later, the surgeon smiled warmly at me. "The tumor was removed completely, Sarah. You're going to make a full recovery. It's a miracle how the funding cleared just in time." I looked up at the ceiling, feeling the strength returning to my limbs, feeling the deep, agonizing physical pain fading away. My body was healing, my mind was sharp, and the digital trap was fully loaded. Arthur thought he had left me to die in the shadows. He had no idea that I had just stepped out of those shadows, completely revitalized, holding the master kill switch to his entire universe. It was the night before the grand medical gala. Arthur finally walked into my recovery room, looking polished, radiant, and completely detached from reality. He held a sleek, expensive leather folder in his hand, the official legal separation agreement. "Sarah, I'm glad to see you're looking better," he said, his tone incredibly casual, as if he were discussing a minor patient discharge. "The board election is tomorrow night. To avoid any potential conflict of interest or media scrutiny regarding our different lifestyles, I think it's best we finalize our legal separation now. I've left the suburban house in your name, but the primary corporate holdings, the financial networks, and the inheritance integration will remain under my entity. Sign here, and let's end this cleanly." I looked at the paperwork, then looked up at his handsome, arrogant face. He truly believed he had won. He truly believed I was a broken, defeated woman who would sign away her father's legacy just to keep a roof over her head. "I'll review it tonight, Arthur," I said softly, keeping my face completely blank. "Go enjoy your gala tomorrow. You've worked so hard for that chief of surgery position." He smiled, a patronizing, condescending smirk that made my skin crawl. "Thank you, Sarah. I knew you'd understand. Some people are meant to operate the system, and others are just meant to be cared for by it. Take care of yourself." As the door clicked shut behind him, I picked up my tablet. I dialed David. "David, the target has officially delivered the final piece of the puzzle. Activate the Total Clear protocol. Set the timer for exactly 9:30 p.m. tomorrow night, right in the middle of his acceptance speech." The Grand Plaza Ballroom was a sea of absolute luxury. Over 600 of the most powerful medical executives, venture capitalists, and political figures in the country were gathered under the massive crystal chandeliers. Waiters in tuxedos glided through the crowd with silver trays of champagne, and a classical string quartet played softly in the background. Arthur stood near the center stage, looking like royalty in a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo, his arm wrapped tightly around Victoria Vance, who was wearing a stunning designer gown. They were laughing, clinking glasses with the hospital's majority shareholder, completely bathed in the adoration of high society. I stood in the shadows of the upper balcony, dressed not in scrubs and not in a patient gown, but in a sharp, elegant navy blue tailored suit. Thanks to my complete physical recovery, I stood tall, my posture unyielding, watching the spectacle below. Arthur had no idea I was in the room. He had no idea that my brother David was sitting in a secure mobile van just 2 blocks away, his fingers poised over a master terminal connected directly to the ballroom's primary high-definition projection network. At exactly 9:15 p.m., the chimes rang throughout the hall, signaling the commencement of the main event. The crowd moved toward their designated luxury tables, and the house lights began to dim. The hospital's majority shareholder stepped up to the gold-plated podium, his voice echoing through the premium sound system. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate innovation, leadership, and vision," the shareholder announced proudly. "And no one embodies these traits more than our nominee for the new chief of surgery, a man who has consolidated our financial structures and brought revolutionary medical device partnerships to our facility. Please welcome Dr. Arthur Pendleton." The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause as Arthur stepped onto the stage, a blinding spotlight illuminating his confident, rehearsed smile. He shook hands with the shareholder, took his place behind the podium, and looked out at the elite crowd. "Thank you, everyone," Arthur began, his voice dripping with smooth, practiced humility. "Success in medicine isn't just about individual skill. It's about building a flawless, integrated network. It's about removing the weaknesses that hold us back and executing a vision with absolute precision. When I look at the future of this hospital, I see an empire built on trust, compliance, and unyielding dedication to excellence. From my vantage point on the upper balcony, I checked my watch. 9:29 p.m. I pulled out my phone and sent a single text message to David. Execute. Suddenly, right in the middle of Arthur's sentence, the massive 60-foot high-definition digital screen behind him, which was supposed to display a slideshow of his surgical achievements, went completely black. The microphone in his hand cut out, emitting a low, eerie hum that caused the entire audience to freeze in confusion. Arthur stopped speaking, his smile faltering as he turned around to look at the massive blank display. He gestured frantically to the tech team in the back, assuming it was a minor system glitch. But it wasn't a glitch. The Total Clear protocol had just gone live. A second later, the massive screen flickered back to life, but it didn't show medical data. It showed a massive, high-contrast digital ledger. At the top, in bold, clear letters, it read, "Offshore Fraud Archive. Target, Dr. Arthur Pendleton." Before anyone could even gasp, the system began automatically scrolling through his private emails with Victoria Vance. The entire room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence as Arthur's own words appeared on the screen for 600 elite guests to read. "She's just a simple clinic nurse. Once the inheritance funds are completely integrated into our new joint offshore structure, I'll handle the separation. For now, she's useful to keep the domestic background quiet." Gasps tore through the ballroom. Victoria Vance's face turned completely white, her jaw dropping as she stared at her own name linked to illegal offshore trust manipulation. Arthur staggered back from the podium, his face transforming from arrogant confidence to sheer, unadulterated terror. "Turn it off! Shut it down right now!" he screamed, his voice cracking without the microphone. But the tech team in the back had been completely locked out of their own master network. David's script had frozen every single terminal in the building. Then came the final, devastating blow. The screen transitioned from the personal betrayal to his professional files. Diagrams, batch numbers, and unapproved purchase orders for the fraudulent pediatric surgical equipment filled the screen, alongside his encrypted signature and the records of the secret stock options sitting in his Cayman account. The words "criminal medical endangerment and malpractice" flashed in bright, warning red across the center of the stage. The ballroom turned into complete, chaotic pandemonium. The hospital's majority shareholder looked like he was about to faint, instantly backing away from Arthur as if he were radioactive. The elite venture capitalists and board members began whispering frantically, pulling out their phones as local media reporters in the room started snapping pictures of the massive, incriminating screen. Arthur stood in the center of the stage, completely naked to the world, his false empire collapsing around him in a matter of seconds. He looked around wildly, his eyes searching the room for an exit, for an explanation, for an escape. And that's when he looked up. Through the flashing lights and the chaos of the crowd, his eyes locked onto mine. I was standing right at the edge of the upper balcony, looking directly down at him. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shouting. I just stood there, looking at him with a cold, piercing composure that knocked the remaining breath right out of his lungs. He realized in that exact terrifying moment that it wasn't a system error. It wasn't a competitor. It was me. The simple clinic nurse he had left to die in a dark hospital room had just dismantled his entire life, his career, his wealth, and his reputation on the grandest stage imaginable. Before he could even take a step toward the stairs, the massive oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open. 4 federal agents in dark suits, accompanied by local law enforcement officers, marched straight through the crowd. They stepped onto the stage, bypassing the frozen board members, and walked directly up to Arthur. As the cold steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists in front of 600 elite witnesses, his medical license, his board seat, his luxury penthouse, and his freedom vanished into thin air. Section 17, the clean slate. 2 days after the gala, I sat in the office of a prestigious federal compliance attorney. The atmosphere was calm, quiet, and professional, a stark contrast to the chaotic battlefield of the Grand Plaza Ballroom. Because the Total Clear protocol had been executed using my legitimate secondary administrative access over our joint marital entity, and because we had preserved the absolute proof of Arthur's unilateral fraud, the federal authorities moved with incredible speed. My father's $2 million trust fund was completely extracted from the frozen Cayman accounts and returned to my exclusive private possession under a new, legally protected asset structure that no one could ever touch. Arthur's personal assets, his luxury real estate contracts, and his elite bank accounts were completely seized by the state to cover the massive federal fines, restitution for the hospital's pediatric department, and upcoming legal liabilities. He was left with absolutely nothing but a gray prison jumpsuit and a public defender. As I signed the final clean divorce decree, the attorney looked at me with a mixture of awe and profound respect. "Mrs. Pendleton, or rather, Ms. Sarah, I have managed high-stakes corporate divorces for 30 years, but I have never seen an empire dismantled with such clean, surgical efficiency. You didn't just win a settlement, you completely reset the board." When you spend years watching surgeons remove malignant growths, you learn exactly where to make the cut, I replied softly, placing the pen down. I stood up, walked out of the glass tower, and stepped into the warm morning sunlight. For the first time in 12 years, the heavy, suffocating weight on my chest was completely gone. I was free. With my health fully restored and my father's legacy safely back in my hands, I didn't buy a luxury penthouse or a sports car. I returned to the place where my true purpose lived, the pediatric hospital ward. But I didn't return as just a shift nurse. I used a significant portion of my recovered inheritance to establish the Father's Legacy Foundation, a fully funded, independent compliance and safety organization dedicated to protecting underprivileged pediatric patients from corporate medical exploitation. The hospital board, desperate to rebuild its ruined reputation after Arthur's exposure, eagerly granted our foundation full oversight authority. The unauthorized prototype devices were completely removed from the facility, replaced with the highest standard certified equipment available. One evening, after finishing a quiet round in the recovery wing, I stood by the large window overlooking the city skyline. A young girl who had successfully undergone a complex procedure earlier that week walked up next to me, holding a small drawing she had made. "Thank you for taking care of me, Nurse Sarah," she whispered, her eyes bright and full of life. I knelt down, took the drawing, and smiled, feeling a deep, profound warmth wash over my soul. This was the true network. Not a network of offshore accounts, luxury titles, or corporate board seats built on lies and manipulation, but a network of human hearts, of healing, of genuine protection. Arthur had built a cage of arrogance and called it an empire. I had broken that cage, and in doing so, I had rebuilt a sanctuary for those who needed it most. A few months later, out of curiosity, I visited the local federal courthouse where Arthur's criminal trial was being finalized. I sat in the very back row of the empty gallery, dressed in my simple, everyday clothes. When Arthur was led into the courtroom by the security guards, my heart didn't beat faster. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel a desire to gloat. He looked broken, his hair grayed, his expensive posture completely shattered by the reality of his impending 10-year prison sentence. As the judge reviewed the final compliance reports, Arthur turned his head and saw me sitting in the shadows of the back row. He stared at me for a long, silent moment, his lips trembling, his eyes filled with a desperate, unspoken plea for forgiveness, for a retraction, for a shred of the unconditional devotion I used to give him. I didn't smile, and I didn't frown. I simply looked at him with the calm, detached expression of a nurse observing a closed case file. I picked up my bag, stood up, and walked out of the courtroom before the judge even hit the gavel. Arthur had believed that power belonged to the one who could manipulate the system the most. He never understood that true power belongs to the one who has nothing to hide. He had locked my inheritance to buy a temporary crown, completely unaware that the truth is a network that cannot be cheated, deleted, or erased. Life is a complex architecture of choices, a continuous cycle where every action leaves an indelible imprint on the fabric of our destiny. We often see people like Arthur, arrogant, ruthless, and entirely consumed by their own ambition, climbing the social and professional ladders of the world by stepping on the hearts and souls of the very people who gave them their foundation. They believe that their wealth, their status, and their encrypted digital fortresses make them invincible. They mistake a partner's patience for weakness and a helper's devotion for stupidity. But the universe has a beautiful, flawless way of rebalancing the scales of justice. Arrogance always builds its own trap. it creates a blind spot so massive that the person cannot see their own ruin growing right beneath their feet. When you choose to value cold numbers over human life, when you choose a luxury car over your partner's survival, you aren't just committing a crime against them, you are signing the eviction notice for your own future. True success cannot be stolen, and it cannot be built on a foundation of betrayal. My father's humble legacy didn't just save my physical body, it became the catalyst that completely cleared a malignant corruption from our lives. As I walk through the hospital corridors today, surrounded by the laughter of healing children and the respect of true professionals, I am reminded that justice isn't always loud, and it isn't always immediate. But when it arrives, it operates with a clinical, absolute perfection that leaves no room for error. If you were in Sarah's position, would you have used the digital evidence to completely dismantle Arthur's life on the grandest stage possible, or would you have quietly settled the matter in a private courtroom? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep, cinematic tales of absolute emotional justice.